never hesitate. But yeah, I'm thrilled to have you here again, Dr. Brock. Before I even introduce you again, like as usual, I want to ask you: you working on anything new? Any new books?
Let me see. Nothing very relevant to today's talks.
Okay, but you still are doing material for that press of yours.
Well, I don't have a press myself. I do a lot of things for the Gorgias press.
Yes, right.
In fact, I haven't done anything recently. The last thing was an edition of some poems by Jacob of Serugh.
Oh.
Mostly people know his mimre, his narrative poems, but these were lyrical poems, of which there are quite a number sitting in the British Library. So I thought it'd be good to make them available. So the Gorgias Press very kindly published them.
Do you know when they're available already then?
Yes, they're already published. So you just have to look up in the catalogue in Gorgias Press.
Wonderful,
some of them are very beautiful, and some turn out to be ones that are well known in the Holy Week liturgy of the Syrian Orthodox Church, but only little bits of them. There's a famous one on the denial of Peter, and there's a couple of famous ones, of which a few stanzas will be very well known to Syrian Orthodox readers, but the whole poem is only available in old manuscripts, and that's what I've tried to give.
Wow, great. That's fantastic. Well, the brother Elijah, his time is limited. He has to leave in a moment. So I want to give him the first chance to pick your brain on the Dormition and the Assumption. We're all thrilled to be here with you. After him, I'll hop on over to my dear brother, Subdeacon Daniel. But Elijah, get us kickstarted, brother.
Thank you, Brother William. Dr. Brock, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm excited to hear your insights as usual. And I do have to leave in about 25 minutes. So if I just leave abruptly, please do not be offended. I do have a commitment here. So my first question has to do with, I know that the Syriac fathers are huge when it comes to the book of Genesis and making connections, especially with Adam and Eve. Are there any connections between their idea of the Assumption or Dormition with the story of Adam and Eve, and specifically Adam and Eve having to, had they passed the test, they would have, been raised up. Is there any connection between that, between those two things there?
That's a question which I'm not sure I can answer. I just give you my impression because it's not something I've actually looked for. And if you don't look for things, you don't find them. You just pass over them and don't notice. My impression is that there aren't any specific links. The thing is that the traditions about the Dormition and Assumption of the Virgin Mary don't appear until about the 5th century. 5th and 6th century, 6th century in particular, is when we have a lot of texts preserved in very early manuscripts too. This is very surprising, but we have a number of 6th century manuscripts with a narrative about the Dormition, and each of these manuscripts is slightly different. So it's a sort of growing narrative, as it were. But I don't recall offhand anyhow any specific links with the Adam and Eve and the Paradise narrative. I mean, certainly Paradise comes into it, but Adam and Eve aren't mentioned in. I don't think. I'm pretty sure I'm correct in saying that they don't appear at all in the narrative texts.
I appreciate
the
that.
Thing the thing is that Adam and Eve are primarily linked with the narratives about the Virgin Mary for the Nativity and during well, the early years of her life. And the Annunciation, of course, is very important. That's the central place where you find reference to Adam and Eve. But for the end of her life, I'd be surprised if there were very striking links. I probably have overlooked some, but certainly in the narrative poems, which, well, narrative texts that I'm thinking of, I'm pretty certain they don't feature.
They don't. Okay. Well, that answers my question sufficiently there. My next question has to do with the evolution of the Assumption or Dormition. I think you talked about this last time we did a show on this, but if you can, I don't know if there's any new information or anything that you can expand on. But if I remember correctly, you had mentioned that the evolution is that the Assumption started with Mary's soul being raised up, and then it developed into Mary's body and soul being raised up, specifically in the Syriac fathers. I don't know if I'm misrepresenting what you said last time, but if you can touch up on that.
Yes, that's basically the situation. What seems to be the case is that there are two surviving traditions in both Syriac and in Greek of the Dormition narratives. And one is called the palm tradition because a palm branch appears several times in the narrative. And in Syriac, this is called the obsequies. And the oldest form of this text is, in fact, very poorly presented evidence today. And it was only in, I think, the 1960s that the complete form of the oldest status of this tradition was discovered, and it was discovered in Ethiopia, or rather in an Ethiopic manuscript. And this manuscript, for the first time, gave the complete text of the oldest form of the palm tradition of the Dormition. What we have in Syriac, we have just fragments of this, and it's only in much later forms, shorter forms of this palm tradition, that we have a lot of texts. And in fact, it got into Greek and became one of the main texts in the Byzantine tradition. There was a certain John of Saloniki who was very influential, and all the later Byzantine texts are heavily dependent on this. Whereas in the Syriac tradition, much more prominent was another related thing. It's related to the palm, at least most people think it's related. I certainly do. This is often known as the Bethlehem tradition because Mary moves from Jerusalem, where she has a house, to Bethlehem. And this tradition also appears in Syriac, and this is the very most prominent tradition in Syriac, and it appears in 6 books. This seems to be a title that you already have quite early on, and it's confusing in that later this got inserted into a complete life of Mary, which was also in 6 books. So the situation is rather confusing with these 2 sets of 6 books. But the original set of 6 books is to do with the Dormition, as opposed to the whole life of the Virgin Mary. And this survives in Syriac in a number of different recensions. And the oldest one has only recently been identified by a French scholar. And what most people know are slightly later forms of the text. And it's these later forms of the text that survive in a number of 6th century manuscripts, but in slightly different forms. And this Bethlehem tradition got translated into Greek, but it at quite an early date. And the only place it appears in Greek is, in fact, in a work that's attributed to John the Theologian, i.e. John of the New Testament. And so it's certainly not by him, but it's scholars call it Pseudo-John. Anyhow, it's in Greek, the Bethlehem tradition is less known. It's much less prominent than the Palm tradition. So the Greek and Syriac traditions are differently, as it were, weighted in the way they look at this tradition. So the Syriac is the Bethlehem tradition, and that's the one that I suppose I'm more familiar with. But in origin, it's very likely that they go back to a common text. In what language, we don't know. Perhaps they were originally oral traditions, and on one side it got into Greek as the tradition of the obsequies, and on the other side it got into Syriac, the tradition of Bethlehem. But that's speculation. So, and quite when the narrative as an oral narrative started up, we simply don't know. It was probably 4th, 5th century. It was certainly around by the 5th century, and it's attested in manuscripts already in the 6th century in Syriac. And in each of these different forms, as the narrative develops, different elements get added, other elements disappear. And so you've got a rather fluid situation that you've got to the basic structure of the story, but the details may vary from one account to another. I hope that more or less answers your question.
That
Probably
does.
not very satisfactory.
No, that was actually one of the best answers I've heard on the top. I mean, you just laid it out very, very well, and I appreciate that. I do have one last question, if that's okay, William, if I can ask one more. So as far as the necessity to believe in the assumption in the Syriac tradition, or even in the Greek, I know in the Roman Catholic Church, it is an absolute necessity to believe in the assumption. Is that the same in the other traditions, in the Syriac and in the Greek? And if so, when did that become a necessity of belief to become a Christian in those traditions?
Well, I don't think any of these Eastern traditions have the same approach to what is necessary to believe, and certainly to in connection with the assumption of the Virgin. They're traditions that are accepted, that are celebrated liturgically, and I suppose if you accept the liturgical tradition, then you are as in fact accepting the the tradition itself, but it's not a condition of being Syrian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox or anything. So it's a different way of looking at the question. Certainly you find very much the same ideas of what's going on in the Latin Roman Catholic and in these Eastern traditions, but the way as where they function ecclesiastically or ecclesiologically is rather different.
Yeah, because the issue that a lot of people have with the Catholic Church is that it makes these Marian dogmas necessities, as if they're part of de fide, they're dogmas, and I guess my question is more, can you be a Syriac Oriental Orthodox and not believe in the bodily assumption or dormition of Mary? And can you be the same as a Greek Orthodox in today's world? And I was just wondering that started? Like like, would it be bizarre for me to be Eastern Orthodox or Syriac Orthodox and not believe in the Assumption or Dormition? I guess.
It would probably be surprising, but I don't think you'd be kicked out, as it were, or
Oh, okay.
condemned. Um, I'm sure there are an awful lot of individuals in all the churches who have very different ideas of what they believe and what they don't believe. But I don't think these are sort of criteria in the Eastern churches, any of the Eastern churches, in the way that they are in the Catholic Church.
That makes sense. Thank you, Dr. Brock. I really appreciate it. I'm going to pass it on to William here.
I will allow my dear brother Sabdeacon to go next, being that he's a guest on my channel, and I will follow up right after him. Sabdeacon, go ahead whenever you're ready, brother. I think you're on mute.
Thank you, William. Thank you, Dr. Todisagi, for doing these questions and answers for us. We appreciate you. Doctors, you were talking about the liturgical acceptance implicitly of the Dormition and Assumption. Do you know when, whether it's before the text became a lot, let's say, like you said, in the 6th century, or afterwards, that it became liturgically part of the tradition?
I don't think we can actually tell for certain, because the earliest liturgical manuscripts that we have tend to be the very earliest, 8th or 9th century. So everything that we have that we know about the Syriac liturgy or liturgical traditions is from several centuries later than the earliest narratives that we have on the Dormition. And so, and we don't have any external evidence. It's generally thought, I think, by liturgical scholars that the liturgical commemoration of the Dormition probably entered the tradition in the 6th century. In the actual narratives of the 6th century, at the end, the apostles are given instructions either by an angel or by Christ himself of how to celebrate various feasts of the Virgin. So that implies that, at least at the time these narratives were produced, people wanted to have celebrations, commemorations of the not just of the Dormition, but also other feasts. And what is interesting is that they specifically seem to connect these feasts with the agricultural year. And in the Syrian Orthodox tradition, as you know, you have St. Mary of the seeds and of the corn shoots, and then the harvest one. And the harvest one, in fact, coincides with the Feast of the Dormition. And it's not quite clear from the narrative text how they see that connection, but the other two are certainly linked with the agricultural year. And those are feasts that you don't have in, I don't think, any other liturgical tradition outside the Syriac ones. So the narrative is interested in those feasts and not with other, say, the Nativity of the Virgin or things like that, which you get much more prominently in the Greek tradition, although later on you do get that introduced into the Syrian Orthodox tradition, as is in all the Eastern traditions.
Sure, thank you.
At this stage, it seems to be a lesser concern.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. I was thinking, from what I've seen, and maybe I'm wrong, it seems like the Syriac tradition, at the earliest, like the 5th or 6th centuries, like you were saying, it it has a lot of text on the topic, and earlier than, let's say, the other traditions. Is there a reason? Do you think like there was some kind of controversy that this developed out of, or why was it like emphasized? Is it potentially Christological? Has any Christological implication here, or why did the Syriacs kind of focus on this subject in the when it got to
Yes,
that?
well, that's a good question. And as often, I don't have a good answer.
You always have good answers, though.
Well, one thing that I can say for certain and with confidence is that we are very fortunate in Syriac in that we have quite a large number of early manuscripts surviving. And this is thanks to the Egyptian climate, which is very dry. And manuscripts don't like getting wet, just like human beings. And so it's manuscripts which were preserved in Egypt have a high likelihood that they will be much older than manuscripts preserved elsewhere in the Eastern Christian world. So that's why we have these 4 or 5 6th century manuscripts with narratives about the Virgin. Some of these are palimpsests, so they're the undertext which has been scrubbed out and then rewritten with something else. But others are complete texts or fragmentary texts. But all from the 6th century, which is remarkably early. And normally in the case of Greek manuscripts, we do have, of course, from Egypt again, some very early fragments, and in some cases, if you're lucky, some complete manuscripts. But on the whole, Greek manuscripts tend to be from 8th, 9th, 10th century onwards. So quite at least a couple of centuries, probably 3 or 4 centuries later than the Syriac. And this applies whatever the text, with all the translations from the Greek fathers, for example, into Syriac. The Syriac version will survive, or often does survive, in a manuscript that is much older than the oldest Greek surviving manuscript. So the Syriac translation is doubly valuable, both for the age of the manuscript and for the fact that the translation was made probably before that, well, certainly before that manuscript was written, maybe a century before, and is so a very early witness to the transmission of the Greek text. And sometimes the Syriac has very interesting, different underlying Greek texts from what we have in the Greek surviving texts. So that means that there's a sort of general picture that Syriac witnesses, Syriac manuscripts, are often much earlier than surviving Greek manuscripts. Now, whether that, in the case of the Dormition legends, means that there was more interest than in the Greek tradition at this time, I think it'd be unwise to make any deduction. But what scholars do think is that these traditions grew up in what we call the Near East. It's very likely that they, at least in part, started off in the region of Jerusalem, since they're dealing with Jerusalem. And the Jerusalem was, of course, very important pilgrimage center with all sorts, and in later on, all sorts of shrines, and Marian shrines. So the area in which these narratives grew up was the, what we would call the Near East, both Jerusalem and no doubt Syria as well. But the exact milieu, it's very difficult to tell where and how they arose.
So, Doctor, in in the East Syriac tradition, they also have the Dormition and the Assumption.
Absolutely.
So in the East Syriac tradition and the West Syriac tradition, do they have kind of this shared common source from where they develop, or do are they parallel and they receive, because in the 5th or 6th century the schism had already happened?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, this is a very interesting question, and it really hasn't been studied very much. There is a life of the Virgin in the East Syriac tradition, which is different from the West Syriac tradition. But if you look at the parts of that concerning the death of the Virgin and her Dormition, you will find that there is a very similar structure to what is found in the Syrian Orthodox narratives. And it's clear that they have a common origin. What has happened is the point of, as it were, separation of the two traditions probably was in the late 5th, early 6th century, and each of these developed in its own way. So the details, as it were, in each tradition tended to become different. New details were added, and so you've got a common structure, but the common framework, but the details are often slightly different. But all the main features are there in the East Syriac narrative.
So maybe because of that, we can theorize that since they have a common origin and the development happens separately in the 5th or 6th centuries, the belief or understanding in such a thing is earlier than the manuscript.
Oh yes, yes, that is certainly so. Yes, how much earlier? It's very difficult to say. You can have all sorts of hypotheses, but the remarkable thing is that it's not until the 5th century that any writer in the Christian East has any real interest in the end of Mary's life. It's all concentrated on around the Annunciation and the birth and so on. So I suppose you could say it's concentrated on the New Testament passages that are concerned, whereas of course there's nothing about Mary's death in the New Testament. So and it's a different set of interests in those earliest texts. And well, of course, the two interests continue side by side once the Dormition interest has come into the tradition.
Todisagi Melfono, go for it.
Thank you very much, brother, and I'll get it right back to you in a moment. Dr. Brock and Subdeacon, you both brought up really, really good points when you mentioned, Dr. Brock, earlier, how the Dormition and the Assumption of Mary are essentially built into the liturgical life of the church. I've always been fascinated by that because I'm a Roman Catholic. Now my brother here, Subdeacon, of course, Syriac Orthodox. But being a Roman Catholic, I deal with a lot of evangelicals. I have a lot of evangelical friends. And we very often hear over here in the Latin Church that, well, the reason you guys believe in the Dormition and the Assumption is because it was defined in Munificentissimus Deus by Pope Pius XII. And then I pose a question to them, and I say, well, if that is a reason why Christians believe in the Dormition and the Assumption, what are you going to do with our Oriental Orthodox brothers and sisters who very clearly were no longer united with us, and they believe it as well? So very clearly, Dr. Brock, we can see that this is built into the liturgical life, as you've said before. What does it mean for something to be built into the liturgical life? Because our evangelical friends that might be tuning in might not know, what does that exactly mean?
Well, the real function of the narrative about or narratives, perhaps one should say, about the Dormition is it portrays Mary as proleptically anticipating the eschaton, the end time, when in the narratives she actually is resurrected at one point, and then she dies again. It's very curious, but that's how the narratives put it. So she's portraying, as in many other respects she portrays in these early narrative texts, the situation that will meet all of us at the eschaton. And so very often in all these traditions, you'll find that there is a paradigm, and then and that's often connected with the Virgin Mary, who provides the paradigm, and then there's the individuals who need to follow that paradigm. So she, in her fate, is an ideal of what we all hope will be our fate. And so the Dormition and many other things connected with it have well, they deal with eschatology, but there's an eschatology that concerns us as well as her, as it were. Does that make any sense?
It really does, perfectly. It really does. You laid it out brilliantly, Dr. Brock. Now, in our private correspondence, we went over a few of the early fathers that talk about the Assumption of Mary, and you told me that there are quite a few ancient manuscripts. And I remember the last time we spoke about this, you briefly mentioned a manuscript, I believe you said, from St. Catherine's Monastery, you had told me. Do you remember anything about that off the top of your head? And what exactly, is that a fragmentary, or what is that?
Well, probably the one that I had in mind then is a fragmentary manuscript. And it's actually a very interesting fragment, because it is under I think 7th or 8th century Lives of Holy Women. And that manuscript, which has been published, it's a very nice collection of women's lives, women's saints' lives. The scribe who wrote it reused a lot of earlier manuscripts, so he washed off the ink and then wrote his own text. But if you spend a lot of time, great lot of patience, and now added modern technology of photographing, digitizing these old manuscripts, these palimpsests as they're called, you can read quite a lot, probably not everything, but a good deal. And part of this manuscript with the women's lives has about 10 folio of a 6th century narrative. So it's not complete, but it's an important witness, and it has some episodes in that which you won't find in other manuscripts of this period. But the interesting thing about the top text is that another manuscript that the scribe used is a very famous text. It's the old Syriac Gospels. Wow. And this is a very important text for New Testament scholarship, because the old Syriac Gospels go back to, well, most people think about 200. So it's very early translation, and very important for the transmission of the Greek text being so early. And this palimpsest, its undertext, is one of, until recently, it was thought to be one of two manuscripts. The other is known as the Curetonian manuscript in the British Library. Neither is complete, but recently a third manuscript or fragmentary manuscript has been found in the new finds from St. Catherine's Monastery, Sinai. And a Russian scholar, a brilliant Russian scholar who's working in Austria, has identified yet another fragmentary palimpsest of the old Syriac Gospels. So this is, we're living in exciting times. And so the palimpsest with the fragment of the Dormition is living next door, as it were, side by side, with this undertext of the old Syriac Gospels. So a nice sort of bedfellow.
Incredible, really beautiful the way you laid that out. Now, the other thing that really does fascinate me, and I wonder if you have an opinion on this. Now, I'm sure if I bring up the name, the Reverend Dr. Daly, do you know who that is? Do you, off the top of your head, do you remember who Father Daly is?
Sorry, who is it?
Father Daly.
Oh, yes.
Okay, good. I was because he did tell me. He said, "Of course, Dr. Brock knows me. We've communicated before." Now, when I bring up Father Daly, Dr. Shoemaker, and the other one, I always butcher her last name, Dr. Ali Katutz. The reason I bring those three scholars up is because they have done a lot of work on the Dormition, the Assumption. And I was talking with Father Daly maybe about a week ago, and he told me that he imagines that he thinks a good estimate of the earliest liturgical evidence of the Dormition and the Assumption would be dating it to around the 2nd century, which is incredibly early. Shoemaker, in his Mary book, says the same. Now, Dr. Katutz dates it quite earlier, which would be probably not in line with the majority of scholarship in the field. Your opinion, is there really any way we can truly know, or is this really just speculation among scholars?
I'm afraid trying to get the date of these of when these things arose is very difficult. And I'm afraid it is hypothesis, we call it speculation.
Yeah.
Speculation can be well-based, can be badly based. Personally, I would be much more cautious. I think one has to admit ignorance sometimes. Scholars don't like to admit that they're ignorant, but it's quite a good thing to admit one's ignorance every now and then. Yeah. And this is somewhere where I think I would personally prefer to admit my ignorance.
And there's nothing wrong with that. There really is nothing wrong with that. One thing that, and I will ask this question, and then I'll pass it over to my brother, Subdeacon, and then, of course, if time permits, I'll ask another one in a moment. But in Father Daly's, the Reverend Dr. Daly's book on the Dormition and the Assumption, and in our dialogue, I did a show with him maybe a few weeks ago, where he mentioned that St. Jacob, and as soon as he brought St. Jacob, he said, "Look, this is Dr. Brock's category of Dr. Brock's area." But he mentioned that St. Jacob had written an account of the Dormition, the Assumption, and then he mentioned a Council of Nisibis, which blew my mind. And then I asked him, I said, "Well, okay, this was presented at the Council of Nisibis, where other bishops would have been aware of it." He said, "Yes, that's correct, but I know nothing about it. Maybe even Dr. Brock doesn't know much about it, but Dr. Brock is the one." He said, "You are the one that translated that text," which doesn't shock me at all. Do we know anything about that particular council?
Well, not beyond the note in the manuscript. So that's all. That is often the case, that our knowledge of what could have been quite an important occasion is dependent on just a scribal note or at the beginning or the ending of a text. There is, as you say, as Father Daly says, a Syriac homily by Jacob, which deals with the Dormition. It's fairly general, but the date of Jacob, he died in 521, makes this important because it shows that these traditions are already around, circulating at this time. And Jacob was a wonderful preacher, so a lot of people would have heard this sermon and then read it when it was written down. Now, unfortunately, I was looking for the text this morning in preparation, and my study is so untidy that I couldn't find it. And my memory is sort of suffering from old age, and I don't remember enough about it to say what was exactly in it. But my impression is that it didn't have anything that is not in the 6th century narratives, of which we have one manuscript in the 6th century, which is in Göttingen today, which is complete, or virtually complete. It's only missing a teeny bit. So we're very fortunate in having this remarkable text, which surprisingly hasn't been edited yet, but as far as I know, several different scholars said that they're in the process of editing it, so I haven't done anything about it, but I have read it. And
I do want to pass it over to my brother Subdeacon, who I know he has some interesting things about Saint Jacob. And if time permits, I will I'll ask another question in a moment. But Subdeacon, take it away, brother.
Sure. Thank you, William. Thank you again, Doctor. I just wanted to ask about, there's a book that was published in the popular patristic series at St. Vladimir's Seminary Press. It was translated by Mary Hansberry, but I think you did the introduction in the book. It's Jacob of Serugh on the Mother of God.
That's right.
Yeah, it's a, I don't know if it's a collection of poems on Saint Mary, I think, and
That's right.
In it is implied that the Dormition and Assumption, I don't know if it's enough to say it's explicit in there's a bodily assumption. Would you say that the reader, the common reader, would understand a bodily assumption from this text, or would you say here it's still an early development?
As I said, I don't remember the text enough to be absolutely certain, but my impression is that there's nothing explicit. Mm-hmm. But of course, that may mean that for Jacob's audience, they already knew the tradition, so he didn't actually need to say anything. So you can argue these things both ways often. Mm-hmm. But as I say, I don't remember enough about precisely the wording, and one needs to look at the very detailed wording of these things to say anything.
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, it's clear for the reader who's not trying to kind of how do I say, play devil's advocate or something.
Yes,
because it's talking about crowning her, and it's talking about physical things. So
yes.
Thank you, Doctor.
Dr. Brock, we do want to be sensitive to your time. Do you have at least another 15 minutes? Would that be okay?
Yes, that's fine.
Wonderful, wonderful. Then let me, here is one that that I really am thrilled to ask you about. Now, I remember the show we did maybe about 3 years ago you briefly mentioned, you said that a lot of the stories of the Dormition, the Assumption, are mythological, you said. But then right away you said, hold on, I'm not using the term mythological with negative connotations. And then you began to briefly break it down. Can you perhaps break it down for the audience here? What do you mean by mythological, and why is that not negative, as most people would think?
Yes, it's a shame that the term does have these negative connotations. It really, it comes from the Greek mythos, a story. So as I understand it, you use mythology when you cannot explain things in a rational way. So you devise a story, and or you make use of a story, and then that story is the bearer of what you want to say, of a truth or position that you want to express. So if you understand mythology in that sense, it's saying what you can't say, as we're saying in poetry, what you can't say in prose. You can't say it in as a way, historical narrative. So often mythology, whatever context you're using, if it's Greek mythology, Christian mythology or something. I had a friend who wrote a book called Christian Mythology, and this was precisely what he understood it in this way. And I think it's quite a helpful term, provided you understand what is intended. It's not a negative thing, but it's telling a story about something in order to convey a truth which you can't put in rational terms in prose, in a prosaic way. And so a lot of traditions that grew up around Mary and the apostles and so on, one could call them mythological. In fact, it was a term used of some of the legends around the apostles in a number of publications of the past, the mythological stories of the apostles and so on. So these are stories which aren't in the New Testament, have no real historical basis, but they are, as it were, telling spiritual truths about the lives and the importance and the relevance of the apostles in different ways. So that that's the sense that I was using mythology. Unfortunately, people do think it's always negative, but that's a pity.
No, I agree. I definitely agree. Another thing that that I'd be very glad to dispel, when I dialogued with the Reverend Dr. Daly, Dr. Katoots, and even Shoemaker, the one thing that I think people have become aware of, that our evangelical friends have been claiming for a few years now, they have been claiming that the origin of these Syriac Dormition accounts find their origin within Gnosticism. And then they will then also go on to noting that Jacob and other figures are heterodox. I think, in my opinion, you tell me what you think, Dr. Brutt, I think that the evangelical crusade against these Dormition and Assumption accounts really has perhaps led some to not understand the Christology of the Orientals, of the Oriental Orthodox Church, simply really not understanding that despite the fact that Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and Oriental are no longer fully united, that doesn't mean that St. Jacob and others had a heterodox theology. It doesn't mean their Christology is heterodox. Do you think maybe these arguments and claims from our evangelical friends really stem from them really not understanding the traditions?
I suspect it could be that. I think the Western Christians do find it very difficult to, as it were, cope with the way Christianity is presented in Eastern Christianity, and especially in the Syriac tradition, partly because it's in the Syriac tradition, so much is expressed through poetry. And poetry, you need to have the right feel for it in order to understand what's going on. And one can read it and it means absolutely nothing to people. But if you read it with, Ephraim would say, if you don't read me with love, you won't understand me. And I think that's actually a rather good principle. And he also says that if you don't read the biblical text with love, it won't speak to you. Jacob has the biblical text answering back to a would-be reader of it. Says, if you don't love me, I'm not going to tell you my secrets.
Yeah.
And I think that is often the case, that you need to be open to a different way of looking at things. And certainly it is a different way, and not straightforward to jump into it from, say, an evangelical background. There are all sorts of assumptions which are quite different.
Yeah, there really are, and I know that we clearly within apostolic Christianity do approach things from a different perspective. But I truly think that the incredible work you've done, that you're doing, really should help a lot of our evangelical friends if they pick up a book of yours and read it, and read the rich tradition that you've helped bring into English, Dr. Brock. I cannot thank you enough for having brought to light many writings that perhaps we would not be aware of in the English language. And I want to thank you for that again. And I do want to, my questions are over. I want to pass it over to my brother, Subdeacon. If he has one final question before we wrap up, I'd like to pass it over to him to give him the opportunity to ask you one final question or two.
No, just one. Thank you. Doctor, you mentioned Western Christians kind of misunderstanding us. Do you, for a Westerner that wants to is potentially interested in the Syriac tradition, but has, let's say, the obstacle or almost like a taboo of, wait, they're Christologically strange from what he's heard, or because the whole anti-Chalcedonian thing seems to be a block before they can see anything else that we have. So how would you explain, or to the Westerner, that our Christology is not what they think it is, and the tradition is actually beautiful for them to look into?
Yes. Well, there's so many inherited misconceptions about Christology. And what is important to remember, that there has been very good modern ecumenical dialogue between Catholic Church and the Syrian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church and the Syrian Orthodox Church. And very early on in these discussions, they have discovered or realized that behind the conflicting verbal formulations of the two natures, one nature, that each side is trying to express the same reality, the same truth, which is in fact beyond rational language. And the fact that this has always been very early realized is something one needs to emphasize, that is simply different tradition of describing the mystery of the incarnation, of the incarnate Christ, which is really beyond rational description. So it's not a case of either or, one nature or two nature. It's the case of both being acceptable, provided you understand the way that they come to that conclusion. But it is very important to realize that the idea that one side is heretical, whether it's from the Chalcedonian side that Syrian Orthodox heretical, or from the Syrian Orthodox side that Chalcedonians heretical, that this is an attitude that should be thrown away. It's an attitude of the past, of misunderstanding, of misconceptions, and this, I think, is this starting point for a proper understanding. And then I would say, try reading some of these Syriac texts in translation, of course, and discover for yourselves that there's actually good stuff. I must say, sometimes when I come across a text, I'm completely bowled over. And I remember in particular when I read Ephraim's commentary on chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis, I thought, what a wonderful approach, and so much more illuminating than anything I'd heard before or been told or read. So Ephraim had a huge insight into the Christian mystery. So
Wonderful.
read Ephraim, read all these wonderful writers, and enjoy them and learn from them.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. May God grant you many years.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Brock, thank you very much. We are incredibly grateful for your time, an incredible show. I do want to give you a moment before we wrap up to put in any plug you'd like to put in. You want to plug that that press that you do work for, anything, which, by the way, I want to say, I hope I don't butcher it. Gorgeous Press is an incredible press, and I recommend anybody get any and all books that you can get from them. Great material done there. But Dr. Brock, any plug you'd like to put in for any work or any, if you have an academia page or anything you want to plug in, the floor is yours right now, my friend.
That's very kind of you. Well, I will put a plug in for the Gorgias Press, because they have done wonderful work in making Syriac texts, reprinting old texts which no other publisher would think of doing, and providing translations and producing a lot of new texts with translations. It's a fantastic piece of work, as well as providing introductory works, tools for the study of Syriac and so on. Another very useful resource is, and I think this got mentioned at some time, the popular patristic section or series of the St. Vladimir's Seminary Press, and they've done a number of Syriac translations from Syriac, and these are nice and cheap, then very easy format for people to use, and they've done wonderful work. A new thing that's starting up, in fact only this year, is the Hidden Pearl Press, run by the Maronites in America, and they've already produced at least a couple of volumes which are bilingual, Syriac, English, and these are of important texts, so one can read a lot of this Syriac literature either through the Gorgias Press, which has a lot of these bilingual texts. You don't have to know Syriac, but you can just read the English if you don't want to learn Syriac. And the same with the Hidden Pearl Press. That's very important, new development. And the St. Vladimir's Seminary Press. They've recently published my translation of some of Isaac of Nineveh, Isaac the Syrian. There's a section which hadn't yet got into English, and this is a section from a newly found text was turned up in the manuscript in the Bodleian about 20 years ago. And this is the first English translation of this. It's Isaac is quite remarkable
Dr. Brock,
insight into the spiritual life.
No doubt. Dr. Brock, thank you very much. That was fantastic. Thank you for your time, my friend. And I want to echo what my dear friend Subdeacon said. May the Lord grant you many, many more years. And may we be able to live as long as you and look even half as good as you. You look fantastic, my friend. You are as lucid as, probably more lucid than we are. You were great, Dr. Brock. I want to thank you so much for your time, my friend.
Right.
I will be in touch.
You.
I will communicate with you. We'll talk again soon. God bless you, my friend. Have a good evening.
Very good. Thank you very much. And
y'all take care.
Thank all the readers for this.